Okay, we're going to begin Chapter 2 now, and this is the chapter that is the physiological side of psychology. Many of you might wonder why we study this in psychology. You may feel like you're in a biology class. But as you learned in Chapter 1, there's a very close connection between what is happening in your mind and what is happening in your body. So this chapter focuses on the nervous system and the endocrine system. The nervous system relays messages in the form of nerve impulses. And we're going to look at central and peripheral nervous system, the effects of the brain on the central nervous system. Then we're going to look at the endocrine system. And the endocrine system is the system that sends chemical messages into the bloodstream. And I think you can see how these two relate. If you burn your finger with a match, what do immediately? You're going to pull your finger away from the fire, away from the match. And that's your spinal cord reacting, part of your central nervous system. And while you're doing that, the body also goes into alert, and the endocrine system releases certain hormones to help you deal with the pain and to help with movement. So the nervous system and the endocrine system really work very closely together, and that's what we're going to look at in this chapter. Also, at the very end, we will look at genetics and the effects of the nature part of nature versus nurture. The nervous system is made up of neurons. The smallest unit of the nervous system is a neuron. And this is a picture of one. In your book, you'll read about the dendrites and the axons. The dendrites pick up messages from other neurons and carry them into the nerve center, which is the soma. Then you'll see how from the soma messages are carried out the axon. And a good way to remember this is the axon acts upon another neuron. So the axon carries the messages from the center, the soma, to another neuron. Axons can be sometimes up to 3 feet. If you look at the axons that are in the spinal cord from the brain to the base of the spinal cord, could be up to 3 feet long. So in order to speed the travel of messages along the axon, we have what's called the myelin sheath that covers the axons. Now, sometimes the myelin sheath breaks down and it doesn't allow the message to be carried. And this is what happens in a disease such as multiple sclerosis. Also, Novocaine blocks the flow of the message down the axon, so you don't feel the pain message when you have Novocaine. In the nervous system, we have 3 different types of neurons. The sensory neurons are neurons that carry messages from the sense organs to the spinal cord or brain. So what's happening out in your body is carried back to that central point, that spinal cord, which carries the messages to the brain. Now the motor neurons, I know I skipped down, but the motor neurons are messages that are carried from the spinal cord out to the muscles and glands. Now most of the neurons are interneurons. About 99% of all neurons are interneurons, or the association neurons, that carry messages from one neuron to the other. So rather than going to a sense organ or to muscles and glands, they're going to each other. So we have more interneurons than we have of any other type of neuron. Now, in your book, there's a good picture, and there's a good picture on the next slide too, of what happens in the neuron, how the message is carried from one neuron to another neuron. The resting potential is when the neurons at rest is in a state of polarization. We have more positive ions outside, greater negative ions inside the cell. It's slightly negative, but it's in a state of polarization, which means that it's like a spring that's coiled up and ready to expand. It's ready to carry a message down that axon once it gets a strong enough stimuli to carry that message. Now, the absolute refractory period is after the neuron has fired. There's a period of time, and this is a very brief period of time, when the neuron will not fire no matter how strong the incoming message is. It will not fire. Now the relative refractory period, if you get a strong enough message coming in, then in the relative refractory period, a message will be carried along the axon. And here's the picture I was talking about that is a good representation of what happens. Resting potential, that axon slightly negative, negative cells inside, positive outside, and one of the ions that helps to carry the messages along the neuron is sodium, and that's what Na plus stands for. We also have potassium, which is K, but this sodium is what usually I talk about more than anything else. And what happens is the membrane of that neuron is semi-permeable, and semi-permeable means that it lets some ions in, keeps some out. Sodium can go in. So at the resting potential, you've got the sodium outside, you've got slightly negative inside, and what happens is the sodium can come inside that membrane. But then because it's negative inside, it's going to kick it back out. And it'll go in, kick it back out, go in, and kick it back out, all along the axon of the neuron. So at the resting potential, it's ready for a stimulus, it gets a message, then it'll fire, like over here is where it's fired. Goes up like this. When it comes down, it's got an absolute refractory period where it will not fire no matter what you do, no matter how strong the message is, very brief amount of time. Then you have a relative refractory period where you're approaching the resting potential where it will fire if you have a strong enough stimuli. Now, at the end of the axon, you have what we call the synaptic button, the terminal button. And between the terminal button and the dendrites of the other cells, remember the axon carries the messages to the dendrites, we have what's called the synapse. Synapse is that area between the terminal button, the end of the axon, and the dendrite. So messages have to be carried from this terminal button over to this dendrite. And how do they get there? In this area in between, we have what we call neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters are stored in this synaptic vesicle right here, and they're released, and then they're picked up over here on the receptor sites. So that's how messages are carried across. We're going to look at different types of neurotransmitters. Okay, acetylcholine, we have some that are stimulators and we have some that are depressants or inhibitors. And acetylcholine is a excitatory neurotransmitter. It plays a role in arousal, attention, memory, motivation. It plays a role in Alzheimer's disease. And we'll look a little bit later what happens when it's prevented from being released into your system. But Alzheimer's patients have a reduction of this acetylcholine, and one of the major things you see in Alzheimer's is this lack of attention and loss of memory. Dopamine plays a role in motor disorders, so Parkinson's disease is very much influenced by dopamine. Also, schizophrenia, we see that the dopamine levels are higher in schizophrenic patients. In smoking, also, nicotine releases dopamine into your system, that mood, calm, because dopamine is an inhibitor. Serotonin is one that we see in many of the abnormal behaviors. It affects emotions, arousal, sleep. It inhibits a lot of behaviors that deal with emotions. It's very much involved in depression, and when you look at Prozac, one of the major drugs out there that deal with depression, what Prozac does is keep serotonin from being reabsorbed, and so you increase the level of serotonin in that area between the terminal button and the receptor sites. Women that suffer from postpartum depression, we see the levels of serotonin are very high right before birth. Right after birth, you have a great drop in this level of serotonin. Norepinephrine is one of the reasons why we see the nervous system and the endocrine system so closely linked. Norepinephrine influences wakefulness and arousal. We see it involved in stressful situations over in the endocrine system. It's released in times of stress. So norepinephrine is a hormone as well as being a neurotransmitter. And then endorphins are what we refer to as our natural painkillers. They're about 54 times more potent than morphine. And scientists have tried to make endorphins synthetically so that we wouldn't get addicted to the morphine that we have to take during pain. But the endorphins, so far, we have not been able to make an artificial endorphin that reacts with our body the same way as the natural endorphin does. But this is when we talk about a runner's high. If any of you have ever exercised a lot and you get this real positive feeling, kind of addictive feeling if you don't exercise, you just feel drawn to having to go out and exercise again, and that's the result of this endorphins. So it's often called a runner's high. But it's much more potent than morphine when injected into the brain. Now these are some drugs and toxins that simulate the action of neurotransmitters: botulism, caffeine, LSD, and we're going to look at each one of these. Botulism is another word for food poisoning. And what happens when you have botulism in your system, it produces a toxin that prevents the release of acetylcholine. And remember, acetylcholine is an excitatory neurotransmitter. So when you don't have the release of acetylcholine, it leads to paralysis or rapid death. Now caffeine, probably all of us have some form of caffeine. Maybe some of you are good and don't use caffeine, but most of us use caffeine, whether it's in coffee or soft drinks. And what happens with caffeine is it releases excitatory neurotransmitters, and it blocks adenosine, which inhibits the excitatory neurotransmitters. So it stimulates you. By blocking the adenosine, you are able to release many more excitatory neurotransmitters into your brain. Now LSD, was very popular back in the probably 1960s when Timothy Lear at Harvard, people didn't realize what LSD would do initially. They used it in experiments at the Army. They used it at Harvard. And what LSD does is it attaches to the receptor sites that release serotonin, and it inhibits the production of serotonin. And it also may affect the levels of dopamine, which produces those dreamlike effects that we have, those hallucinations. Okay, I didn't have a slide with cocaine, but cocaine is another drug that prevents the action of a neurotransmitter. In this case, it prevents dopamine from being reabsorbed, and that's why you get this heightened arousal when you take cocaine. Schizophrenia, I also said, was involved in dopamine. I'm looking over my notes to make sure I haven't missed anything on the neurotransmitters. But they are very important to the way your body reacts, to the way you think. That's why it's so serious, and you have to be very careful about what type of drugs you take that would interfere with those natural reactions of your neurotransmitters. All right, now we're going to go into a little bit more about the nervous system. And this is a nice graph, I think, to help you get organized and keep your notes when you're going through studying the nervous system and the different parts of the nervous system. There are two main parts, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And if you think about central, think about what is right in the middle. That's what central is. You have your brain and your spinal cord. It should be very simple to remember that, brain and spinal cord. Now you are going to have to know the different parts of the brain and what we have in each one, in the hindbrain, midbrain, forebrain. So you really need to expand this graph to include the other parts of the brain. We're going to look at the peripheral nervous system. We've got the somatic nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, and the different parts of the autonomic nervous system. So let's go to the next slide and start looking at the brain. I've got a cute diagram of the brain in your module section for Chapter 2. Just looks at how the male and the female brain differs. So I hope you take some a chance to look at that. There's a lot of research out there now in studying the difference between the male and female brain. It said this was a study that was done. Men and women listened to taped excerpts from a novel while inside an MRI scanner, and then the researchers analyzed images of the brain flow to various points of the parts of the brain. And they found with men that the activity was confined to the left temporal lobe, the region that's associated with listening and speech. Where with women, they found that activity occurred in both the temporal lobes. Although predominantly the left, they did see activity on both sides of the brain, and the right side of the brain is associated with understanding abstract concepts. So they do see that men seem to be more focused. That's why they like to do one thing at a time, where women can have activity on both sides of their brain at the same time. So we're going to look at the brain. 90% of all the body's neurons are located in the brain, and we know the importance of the brain. When somebody is dying, if their heart is still working, they're still breathing, but if their brain stops, then they are declared dead. So the brain is really what is considered the live part of a human being. So in the brain, we're going to see these different parts. We have a forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. The forebrain is the one that has evolved the latest. So the forebrain is probably the part that makes us different from animals. If we look at the hindbrain, it was the earliest to evolve. Let's go to the next slide. In the hindbrain, you have three different parts. The medulla connects to the spinal cord, and it controls your breathing, your heart rate, your blood pressure. So do you see how it's controlling some of those automatic parts of our body, things that we do without thinking? Then the pons controls the sleep-wake cycle, and we'll see when we get to the endocrine system that there's also a gland that controls the sleep-wake cycle. So the endocrine system, the nervous system are working together very closely. The cerebellum involves balance and coordination of movement. And you see if people have accidents, motorcycle accidents, car accidents where they've got damage to the cerebellum, then they have trouble with the coordination when they're walking and that. Now the midbrain is where pain is registered, and also where hearing and vision are relayed up into the forebrain, to the appropriate parts of the forebrain. And the forebrain is this structure that has evolved is the latest to evolve. And in the forebrain we have the structures, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the cerebral cortex. The thalamus I call a switching station, or here it's called sensory switchboard. Messages are relayed to the thalamus, and then the thalamus decides where the message needs to go. It translates the message from the sense receptors and sends it to the appropriate part of the brain. It's like those old toy trains that we used to play with, where we could turn the switch one way or the other and direct the train on the track the direction we want to go. That's why I think of it as a switching station. It's that switchboard that controls messages and their passageway to the brain. Now we'll see the hypothalamus is the part of the brain, the forebrain, that is very closely linked to the endocrine system. It governs motivational behavior. Hunger, thirst, sex, we'll see, are primary motivators. Sleep, temperature control of your body. All of this is regulated by the hypothalamus, which regulates hormone release in the endocrine system. It controls emotional behavior such as rage, terror, pleasure. It's essential in times of stress. So the hypothalamus is a very important part of the brain that reacts with that endocrine system and controls a lot of what is happening to you on a daily basis. Now the cerebral cortex is where you process thought, vision, language, memory, and emotions. And we're going to look at the cerebral cortex. It's the outer surface of the cerebral hemisphere, we'll see we have two hemispheres, and whenever you look at a brain, you see that there's a center that goes down between the two parts of the brain, and that is the cerebral cortex is what covers the two cerebral hemispheres. It's 6 cells deep. It's the most recently evolved. It's more highly developed in humans than in any other species. 70% of the neurons are located in the cerebral cortex part, in the two cerebral hemispheres that make up the cerebral cortex. And the convolutions that we see, which you can see in this picture here, are unique to each individual. Your convolutions are like a fingerprint for you. So we're going to look at the different structures in the brain. You have the frontal lobes, parietal lobes, temporal lobes, and occipital lobes. These are all association areas. Well, I thought we had a slide on the different lobes, but let me go over them real quick with you before we go on to look at this. Well, this is the frontal lobe. Okay, we're going to start at the top. Frontal lobe is really half the volume of the brain is in the frontal lobe, and this is where we see voluntary movement controlled, attention behavior, goal-directed behavior. When we look at activity in ADD patients, we see a lot of activity in this area of the frontal lobe. It's the one that we least understand, but we think a lot of the critical thinking is happening in this frontal lobe. The parietal lobes are sensations of touch. They receive your sensory information, so they give you information about touch, spatial ability, which means your bodily position, so you know what direction you're going, what direction your body is in. The temporal lobe is where you process information on hearing, smell, balance, and equilibrium. So sometimes when people have damage, stroke damage in that, to the temporal lobe, then they have trouble recognizing faces. Your smell center is there. They have trouble recognizing different smells. They have trouble with their balance or comprehending language if they have trouble with this temporal lobe. And the occipital lobe is the area which processes information on visual information, any visual signals that are sent to your lobe. Now these lobes are located on both sides of the cerebral cortex in both hemispheres of the cerebral cortex. The reticular formation is a network of neurons that is surrounds the brain. You can see here it's a network of neurons in the hindbrain, midbrain, and part of the forebrain. And what the reticular formation does is it's that alarm system in your brain that says, wake up. It's like the fire alarm going off in your house. It wakes you up. It arouses your body when you have to deal with certain situations. And the limbic system is another system that has a ring of structures around the brain. It's not located like the four lobes are in certain areas of the brain. Both the reticular formation and the limbic system surround the brain. And the limbic system is very important in terms of formation of new memories. It's connected to the hypothalamus. You can see the hypothalamus in this area. The parts of the limbic system down here, the amygdala and the hippocampus, are the hippocampus is very important in the formation of memories and in storing memories. This is where we see damage during Alzheimer's disease. And then the amygdala also for emotional behavior. In that picture you saw before, it was a skull with a taper through it. That's your book tells you the story about Phineas Gage, and it's a true story where the man had a taper in a railroad accident that went through his skull, and what happened was this taper separated the limbic system from the cerebral cortex, and the cerebral cortex is where you have that cognitive thinking, where you control your behavior, so we're not animalistic. And what they saw in Phineas Gage was a much more animal behavior after his accident, where he couldn't control his emotions. The emotions are located in that limbic system, And if it's not controlled by the cerebral cortex that says this is not an appropriate place to behave like that, then you see more of the animalistic behavior coming out. Okay, this is the hippocampus and the amygdala are the two important parts of the limbic system. Hippocampus in the is important in processing memory, and the amygdala involved in fear and aggression. So do you see how these are probably parts that have been with us for a long time? You know, when we were living in the caveman times, we really needed to have this ability to be aggressive, to fear our flight or fight mode, where we had to fight the animal or run away from the animal. And this goes back to this amygdala, which is involved in the stressful times. All right, this is goes back to the cerebral cortex that we talked about before, the cerebral hemispheres. We have two hemispheres, a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. The lobes are located in both parts of the hemisphere, but we do see some specific behavior in certain hemispheres. Although we think that language does go on in both hemispheres, in the left hemisphere we see the Broca center and the Wernicke center, and both of these two centers are important for speech. And if you've ever seen, known anyone that's had a stroke in the left hemisphere, then that's when they have trouble with their speaking. And remember, the axons cross over. So when the axons cross over, things that happen in your left area are controlled by the right side of the brain. So if you have a stroke on the right side of the brain, you're going to be paralyzed, could be paralyzed on the left side of your body. But in the left hemisphere is where we see the speech and language centers. On the right hemisphere is where we see the spatial construction. So people who have more activity in the right hemisphere tend to be more creative people. They have that facial recognition, nonverbal imagery. We do see a lot more activity on the right side for those that are real creative, and we see more activity on the left side for those who have stronger analytical skills. And they've done some split brain research when they have the person who's had the corpus callosum is that connection between the two hemispheres, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, and in some people they have cut the corpus callosum because the first time they did it was to help deal with seizures in people who were suffering from epilepsy, and they found when they did that the person lost certain abilities. And in this case, the person is looking in the left, on the left side where they have a hammer and a plier and a ball. So they're looking over on the left side. The message from the left side is carried to the right side because he doesn't have the ability for language and speech located on the right side. He can't say that that's a hammer. But if you ask him to pick up a hammer, he can do that. Now, if you do put the image on the right side, then that message is carried to the left hemisphere where you do have the Wernicke and the Broca center, so that the person here can say, I see a ball. The second part of the central nervous system is the spinal cord. And the spinal cord only has two purposes: reflexive actions and carrying messages back and forth from the brain to the sensory organs, from the muscles to the brain. And you can see here in this diagram, many of you have probably had a physical before where you've been hit with this rubber hammer. It's been a long time since I've had one. I don't know if they still do this. But the reason the doctor did that was to check your reflexes. So if you've had a physical and that's happened, they're just making sure your spinal cord is working properly. But the only two functions of the spinal cord are reflexes and carrying messages back and forth along the spinal cord. All right, let's look at the second part of the nervous system. The first, the central nervous system, composed of just the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is composed of the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. Okay, the sympathetic nervous system, I don't think I can go back, so I'm just going to talk to you about that real quick. But the somatic nervous system is the part that carries the messages back and forth. So this is where you have all the sensory or afferent neurons, all the efferent or motor neurons that carry messages back and forth along the spinal cord from your sense organs to the brain, from the brain to the muscles and glands. So that was the somatic nervous system. Now in the autonomic nervous system, we have two parts. We have the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And this is where autonomic, you think about just automatic. This is the area where you're breathing, proper flow of blood, your emotions are controlled, things that happen automatically. In times of stress, when you're frightened or when you're angry, the sympathetic nervous system is the most active. What happens is your body is prepared to fight or to flee. So your pupils are dilated, your heart rate is accelerated, your stomach's secretions are inhibited. This is why you really don't want to eat something before you know you're going to have a stressful situation. If you participate in any kind of athletic event, you don't eat too soon to the event because your body shuts down. All the energy you have is geared toward running away or fighting the adversary. So the sympathetic nervous system is geared up during time of anger or fear or stress. The parasympathetic nervous system is what is used to calm you back down. And if you look at the picture in your book, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system are all connected to the same organs. So if one stimulates you, the other one has to bring you back down. If you've ever been in a large argument, a big fight with somebody, you don't calm down immediately. In fact, it takes about 24 to 48 hours for your body to return to that calm, resting state. So the sympathetic nervous system gears you up. The parasympathetic nervous system, if you can see here, is doing exactly the opposite of what the sympathetic nervous system did. And the parasympathetic nervous system calms you back down. So these are all the slides that we have on the central nervous system. Make sure you're aware of the different parts of the brain, the different lobes and what they're responsible for, the limbic system, the reticular formation, peripheral nervous system, central nervous system, neurons. Okay, all those are very important when you take your test on this part of the Chapter 2. All right, now we're going to go into the endocrine system. And in the endocrine system, the only thing that you're going to be responsible for is knowing the organ and what hormone is attached to that organ and associated with that organ and what the effects that the hormone has. So in the endocrine system, we see it's consistent of glands, and these are tissues that produce and release hormones, and hormones are the chemical substances that help regulate the body activities. And we're going to see how some of these hormones are identical to the neurotransmitters that we saw in the brain in the central nervous system. You know, if you think about hormones, just for a minute before we go to the next slide, hormones are responsible for differences in your vitality level. There are differences in metabolic rates, the growth and sexual development, your emotional balance. So your endocrine system plays a very important part in the development of an individual. We'll see how it's closely regulated by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus really regulates the release of both the neurotransmitters and the hormones. Okay, the thyroid gland, and maybe some of you know people who have trouble with the thyroid gland, located in the neck area, produces thyroxine, which regulates the body's rate of metabolism. If you have too much thyroxine, then people have enormous amount of energy. They can eat a lot because their body is metabolizing the food at a quick rate. If they have a too low a rate of thyroxine, then those are the people who are more lethargic, and have a tendency to get heavier. Usually if a person has a weight problem, the first thing they'll do is check the thyroxine level and see if the body is producing the right amount for the person. Parathyroid glands are located around the thyroid gland. They produce parathormone, and the parathormone balances the levels of calcium and phosphate in the blood. This also has an effect on the excitability of the nervous system. The calcium levels affect the excitability of the nervous system, which again will affect your metabolic rate. So both the thyroid and the parathyroid have to do with your energy level and your metabolism. Now the pineal gland regulates the activity level over the course of a day. And remember we looked at PONS regulating the sleep-wake cycle? The pineal gland releases a hormone called melatonin. It's M-E-L-A-T-O-N-I-N, melatonin, and it regulates the activity level over the course of a day. In the morning, melatonin is reduced so that your body wakes up, and in the evening it's increased so that your body will calm down, relax, so you can go back to sleep. This is what is difficult in people who travel and go across time zones, or people who swing shifts. Their body has trouble regulating this melatonin, and there are some drugs now that are sold. They sell them in drugstores or in health food stores that can help regulate your melatonin level, because this way people that travel can reverse their melatonin level so that in the morning they can reduce it, in the evening they can increase it when they need to go to sleep. There's an illness out there that's called SAD, S-A-D, seasonal affective disorder, and this has to do with people who live in climates where you see a lot of darkness, or people who work in businesses where they get up in the morning and go to work and it's dark, and when they leave it's dark and it's not well lit in their business, and they don't get enough sunlight. Sunlight helps to regulate the levels of melatonin. So a lot of times the treatment for seasonal affective disorder is to have one of those UV lights so you can get the artificial sunlight, which releases the melatonin into your system. Pituitary gland is a gland that we call the master gland because it produces more hormones than any other of the glands. And one of the hormones it does produce is growth hormone. So if you get an excessive amount of growth hormone, then you have the giants. If you don't get enough growth hormone in the development of the child, then you have the midgets. So the pituitary gland is very important. It helps blood pressure raise. It regulates the water in cells, contractions during pregnancy, has effect on sexual behavior. So the pituitary gland is what we call the master gland. And you can see here in the posterior pituitary where thirst, sexual behavior, parental and maternal behaviors are affected in the pituitary by the hormone levels. In the anterior pituitary, it's going to produce hormones that cause other glands to produce hormones, regulates body growth, and this is why you have the giants or the midgets, and it also affects motivation and emotions. So the pituitary gland is what we call the master gland. The gonads are the sex glands for males and females. Males, it would be the testes, and in females it would be the ovaries. In males, they produce testosterone or androgens, and in females, the estrogen is the hormone that's produced. The adrenal glands we see active during times of stress, and the adrenal cortex is that outer covering. It releases hormones such as adrenaline. It influences epinephrine, norepinephrine, hormones that we use during times of dealing with stress. The adrenal medulla is the inner core of this gland. It also produces hormones that deal with stress. And the pancreas is the last one, pretty sure it's the last one we're going to look at. And this is an organ that lays between the stomach and the small intestine. And it's very important for secreting insulin to regulate your blood sugar level. So probably we all know what is the illness that is associated when we don't get enough insulin or we get too much insulin in our body, which is diabetes. Your body doesn't produce enough insulin, so you get too much sugar built up in your system that can cause some major health problems. So some people can regulate the insulin level with their diet. Some people have to have injections of insulin on a daily basis. It's really a shame in our society now with the obesity level that we see, that we're seeing a great increase in type 2 diabetes. You may have a predisposition to type 2, genetic predisposition, but if you maintain your exercise level and your weight level, you would never have the type 2 diabetes. Now, type 1 is childhood diabetes. Many times people are born with it, or illness can cause it early in life. But the type 2 is one that we can control if we don't allow ourselves to get overweight, to stress our system out so that it can no longer deal with the amount of sugar that we have in the system. So just be careful. There's really a large increase right now, and what's sad is that we see it a lot in young children. Okay, so that's the endocrine system. Know those major glands. Know the hormones that are secreted from the major glands. Know what each hormone controls, what behavior it's affecting. All right, the last part of this chapter, we've done central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, endocrine system. The last part is on genetics. Okay, in genetics, we have traits, and this is the characteristics by which we differ. If I asked you to tell me about a good friend of yours and asked you to list some of their behaviors, those would probably be the traits of that person. They're generous, they're excitable, they're angry, they're pleasant, they're moody. Those would be traits of that person, characteristics that they differ. They're tall, they're short, they're heavy, they're slim, brown eyes, blue eyes. Okay, and in the transmission of these traits from one generation to the next, we call that heredity. We're transferring that genetic makeup from one source to another. And genes are the elements that control the transmission of traits. And the genes are found on the chromosomes. So humans each have 23 pairs of chromosomes. They're pairs of thread-like bodies within the cell nucleus that contains the genes. So that genetic makeup that controls who you are, what you look like, is located on the chromosomes within that cell nucleus. And within the genes, the main ingredient of the chromosomes and the genes is DNA. And there's a great book out there called The Double Helix, where it talks about how they discovered DNA, how they could see the design of the DNA in terms of this design that had the helix design. I'm moving my hands and you can't see it, but the design goes kind of in a circle downward with the DNA. And the DNA is that major ingredient of the genes and the chromosomes that determines the traits that's carried from one generation to the other generation. Now, in terms of the genes, you have some pairs that are dominant, some and you have some that are recessive. We see, like in terms of eye color, brown color seems to be dominant over blue. So you might have both a gene for brown eye and a gene for blue eye. But if you have the brown eye gene, then that's going to be dominant over a recessive gene that carries the blue eyes. So this is why you can have brown eye parents that end up with blue eye children. If they both are carrying this recessive gene for blue eyes, it has a possibility of combining, 25% chance of combining and producing a blue-eyed child. Humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes. We see a different number in different animals, but we are beginning to map the chromosomes and looking for each chromosome, what's affected by the gene on the chromosomes, and we see on the chromosome number 21 affects Down syndrome. 19, Alzheimer's. They're beginning to look at some other chromosomes that tend to control alcoholism. So this brings with it a lot of decision making that you may have when you have children. Not in my generation, but in your generation, you might have the ability to fix some of these flaws in your chromosomes before a child is born. So if you could fix the number 21 so we don't see Down syndrome children, I mean, that would be really nice, wouldn't it? But do we want to fix the XY chromosome so that we always are producing boys or we're always producing girls? You know, there's some decision making in here when you start playing around with your genetic makeup. Okay, how can we study genes? You know, how can we study the effects of the DNA on us as we develop from one generation to the next generation? And in animals and that, we can have strain studies. In peas, when it was first studied, what was studied were pea pods to look at the genetic makeup. But we don't do strain studies with humans. We don't breed certain people together to see what they can produce. And that's what strain studies are, studies of inheritable behavioral traits using animals that have been inbred to produce strains that are genetically similar to one another. So mice are used a lot in this case because they can reproduce on a very quick basis. The cycle is very slow, very quick, so you can look at the effects of the traits carried from one generation to another. Now, we don't do strain studies in humans, but we do selection studies, don't we? If we look at animals right now, that we're having the Triple Crown, and we're looking at, you know, a horse that might be able to win the Triple Crown, that horse has certain abilities that other horses don't have. And what we want to do, and what horse breeders want to do, is maintain those traits in the offsprings of this horse. So we do selective studies with animals. We do it with roses. We try to graft roses together so that we can produce a perfect rose. With humans, once again, we don't officially do selective studies, but probably all of us do in a way. Don't we look for the person that we think will be a good father to produce children by, you know, or a good mother? In a way, we're doing selective studies when we're picking the person that we want to have children with. Even though we don't do it officially, we don't do it scientifically, I think we do it. And now they have sperm banks out there where you can pay so much money to get an egg fertilized by what we consider a genius in the sperm bank. But you have to realize where's the other part of that 23 chromosomes coming from, and it's coming from you. So, you know, you've got the pairing of the two, what's going to be dominant, what's going to show. There was also a model who put her egg out on the internet for $1 million. So, you know, once again, you're taking the DNA of the model, but you've also got to realize that you're mixing it with the DNA of the father. So, you know, if you look at the way horses are bred, you can tell I like horses, but a lot of times you take, you know, a dark horse and you end up with a spotted horse. So just because you're drawing from good DNA, it doesn't indicate necessarily what you're going to have as a product from it. So we really don't do strain studies or selective studies with humans. So how can we study humans? And the only way we have are by family studies. So you look at a trait and see how has it come down through your family. You know, and probably a lot of times people say, you know, you're just like your Aunt Carol, or you're just like your grandfather. You know, that's looking at the study of traits coming down through your family. So we do look at family studies, and we look at twin studies. Twin studies are probably the best to really look at the influence of heredity and environment. Because in twins, if you have identical twins, On the next slide, it talks about identical twins and fraternal twins. If you have identical twins, then that means their DNA is exactly the same. Now, fraternal twins are really two separate eggs, so they're really not any more similar than siblings would be. With fraternal twins, what we see more is the effect of environment, because they do have the family genetics, but it's just like if you were born and your sister was born 3 years later. Fraternal twins are similar in terms of just coming from the same family, but they're the same age. So as they grow up, they're probably in the same environment. Identical twins are twins that come from the same egg that's split. This is why you see sometimes conjoined twins when the egg doesn't split totally. But you have identical twins, same DNA. So if you're studying identical twins, then what should be the only difference in traits that you see come out in identical twins? And it should be the effects of the environment. And this is what we've used adoptive studies for. Problem is now it's hard to find twins that were separated at birth. But if you can find children who were adopted at birth by parents, so that you had one twin in one environment, another twin in a different environment, then you could look at really the effects of just the DNA to see what is similar about these two twins. And they've done studies like this, and it's amazing when you look at it. Their IQs, this is why we know IQ is very much influenced by genetics. The IQs are very similar. A lot of times we see twins that haven't seen each other when they meet. They're dressed in a similar manner. They've named their pets similar names. They have the same hairstyles. A lot of similar behavior. So we can look at traits in adoptive twins, and if they are similar and yet these people have lived in different environments, then we have to say this trait probably is influenced by genetics or nature more than it is influenced by the environment or nurture. So this is why we do adoptive studies. We want to look at the effects of heredity and environment. And I think we know today that we really can't separate them. A lot of research now is done today to look at the effects of both on certain traits. So it's very hard now to separate the nature versus the nurture. Okay, and a lot of this research that is done in genetics is based on the natural selection of Darwin's natural selection. He went on the voyage of the Beagle, and this is where he began to see that different types of animals, depending on their environment, had different traits. It was like they adapted to the environment, and this is where we get the survival of the fittest. But variations existed between individual members of species. He'd see the same bird on different islands, but saw different characteristics that the bird had adopted. Individuals with the advantageous characteristics are more likely to survive and reproduce. This is survival of the fittest. And advantaged offsprings are more likely to survive and pass on these genes to their offsprings. So Darwin, the idea of evolution is looking at the effects of the genetics on survival. So it's a combination of both the environment and whatever genetic makeup you had. And there's some great media reports. Y'all hopefully are looking for media reports, but some of the ones that your classmates have shared in the past, one was on chimps, humans, 98% are similar genetic makeup. They say they found that the body tissues of the two, chimps and humans, are very similar, but the human brain has about 5 times more genetic activity. So even though we share 98% of our genetic makeup with a chimpanzee, remember that frontal lobe that we talked about? The brain has much more activity than it does in a chimpanzee. So the brain, it says this study suggests that changes in the brain were one of the main ways that humans evolved away from the chimps. Chimpanzees are more closely related to humans than any other primate. The two are thought to have shared a common ancestor 5 to 7 million years ago, although just what that ancient primate looked like is unknown. Since then, chimps and humans have evolved separately, with humans developing a brain about twice the size of a chimp's brain. It says monkeys, humans, and chimps are thought to have a common ancestry about 13 million years ago. So there's a lot of research out there that says we're very similar. This is why we test a lot of medication and that on chimpanzees. It says if you look at the blood of the chimp and the human, it's very hard to tell them apart. Humans are expressing more gene differences in the brain, and that is what enables us to do what we can do that's different from the monkey. He also in this article said he noted that chimps can become infected with HIV, the AIDS virus, and never get sick. They also suffer no ill effects from an infection of another virus, which is the most serious form of malaria and fatal to thousands of humans. So they're trying to look at why do chimps have this natural aversion to these diseases. Even though they become affected with it, they don't get the symptoms from it and they don't get the illness. So if we could use the genetic similarities to try and cure AIDS, it would be very, very good for our society. The other part of this chapter, before we end, because this is the last slide, is in your lifetime you're going to see a lot of research on stem cell. In fact, in Chapter 2, I ask you in the bulletin board to discuss this. So I want to make sure that you really spend some time to learn about stem cell research. It's controversial in some respect in terms of where the stem cells come from, but there's many beneficial things that can come from studying stem cells. And right now, some of those sources are from the embryos of children who were stillborn or aborted, from the placenta of aborted babies. But they're doing a lot of work on trying to develop adult stem cells. And stem cells we know can help in Parkinson's disease. This is another article where it said researchers have found measuring levels of a type of adult stem cell in the bloodstream might indicate a person's risk of developing heart disease. And it says, for instance, the cells may be used up by repairing damage done by other risk factors, or those risk factors could directly affect the survival of the cells themselves. So what stem cells can do when they're injected into the body, they tend to go to the places where damage has been done. They think stem cells can help in victims who've been paralyzed by accidents, can go in and regenerate the nerves in that area. So a lot of research is done out there by stem cells. I think one of the things that frightens people is the idea that we could clone another human being, because one source of stem cells is by creating an embryo in a petri dish and using the stem cells from that. But if that embryo was put into a womb, it could develop further. But there is medical stem cell research and there is reproductive stem cell research. So there are two separate areas. Many people support the medical research stem cell projects. They don't approve of the reproductive side of it. So just make sure you do some reading on this and be aware of it. Harvard University plans to launch a multi-million-dollar center to grow and study human embryonic stem cells. This was April 23rd of 2004, so it's very current. What they're doing, it says Harvard believes stem cell research is essential in advancing potential treatments for serious human ills. Harvard will continue to work within the laws and the regulations in advancing these treatments. And you've probably seen celebrities who are out there with Parkinson's disease. They think it could help with Alzheimer's disease to rebuild the nerve cells in the brain that affect the Alzheimer's. So there's a lot of benefit to doing this stem cell research. And once again, the controversial part of using embryonic cells, they're beginning to do a lot more research on looking at the use of adult stem cells. So I hope you do give yourself some time. There's some links in your bulletin board where you can get some more information about the stem cell research. I know this is a hard chapter. Make sure you've got your terms straight and you studied it very carefully before you take the test.